Horror on the Orient Express. Chapter 5. Note for Note. A priest, an occultist, a maid, a doctor, and a detective board a train. To Leopold, this journey felt like a joke, and a bad one at that, seeing the state poor Rose had been in. The maid was locked up in her berth, nursing her shriveled skin. The Duke had shown the extent of his powers, and the Belgian shuddered at the thought of crossing Switzerland ever again. He peered out of the window, his head languidly resting in his hand. The lakes of northern Italy shimmered alongside the Orient Express, beds of diamond pebbles rolling in the white light of the winter sun. His eyes followed the serpentine form of the lakes and the silhouette of the mountains in the distance. The private eye let his mind wander, forgetting about the landscape. His thoughts raced toward his absentee father, with a knot forming in the pit of his stomach. He wrestled with the knot, pushing it down, out of his tummy and into his entrails, burying it as deep as he could. The young man sat there for long hours, until the lakes were long gone. In their stead, a sea of factories. Dark plumes rose from the many chimneys, dispersing into the overcast sky. Claudia tore him away from his reverie, accompanied by a frail but better-looking Rose. The maid's wrinkles had receded fast with the help of water and salts, but she was closer to 40 years old than 20.
"We're about to enter Milan, Leopold. Get your passport ready,"
sighed the occultist, before pursuing the guests of the Orient Express, already moving toward the exit. Claudia and Rose were quickly followed by Dr. Marsh and Giovanni. Leopold rose, following the rest of the troop into the narrow corridor of the next carriage. The priest gently played with his shoulders to overtake the doctor and the maid and get to Claudia.
Signorina Claudia, if you please, I would like to disembark first. You are in Italy now, my country. The fascisti and black shirts will be crawling through Milan, and I would like to aid our little group in passing through a checkpoint unscathed. You see, Mr. Mussolini's clout is increasing by the day, and Milan was his base until a few weeks ago. His black shirts are a dangerous sort. I have heard the reports of them forcibly administering castor oil to those with socialist leanings, or even just for being drunk in public.
As the Orient Express came to a halt, the occultist gave way to the priest, who nodded courteously as he made his way out. The rest of the investigators walked a short distance away from the man of the cloth, anxious at the revelations made by Giovanni. Standing straight as an arrow, the priest headed for the checkpoint, where a mass of black shirts were already making the sign of the cross at his gesture. The charismatic ecclesiast leaned gently toward the patrol, hands clutched together like an obsequious peddler. Within minutes, the brutes let the priest go through and gestured to the rest of his company to come through. No passport asked. The group moved through Milano Centrale quickly, away from the black shirts. The station looked like a war-torn building, almost a pile of rubble. Giovanni proceeded to explain that the local government was currently expanding and rebuilding the terminal into something more aligned with Mussolini's architectural likings. Quick on his feet, the priest asked for directions toward the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II, where the hotel booked by Caterina Cavallaro awaited them. He promptly translated the instructions to the rest of the group before heading to the Duomo, leaving his fellow travelers in a sea of Italians.
"So much for our translator,"
muttered Leopold beneath his breath.
"Don't worry, with my Latin, we might do just fine,"
started Elijah cheerfully, before the end of the sentence died in his throat as he looked at Leopold rolling his eyes in front of him. They walked for a short while in Milan, asking passers-by if they were indeed on the right path to the Galleria. It dawned upon Rose that Milanese all wore on their faces the traces of grief, as if joy had vacated their souls, their saddened eyes and pouty lips contrasting with their elegance. They soon arrived at the Piazza del Duomo. In front of them stood the cathedral, its stunted squat base rising into 98 spires, spears piercing the heavens. To their left, the long arm of the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, its steel and glass canopy letting the cold winter light ricochet against the saffron and blonde facades and sculptures of the gallery. As soon as they stepped under the glassy canopy, it was quite easy for the four travelers to find their lodgings, a discreet and luxurious hotel. When asking for a room booked in Cavallaro's name for a party of 6, the receptionist winced as if stricken by a painful memory, though none of the companions noted it. Bellboys ushered them to their suite, spanning above the famous Biffy on the 3rd floor, just below the sky of steel. Nestled on their balcony, the investigators could see all of Milan walking by, faces bleak, brows somber. Moving back into the living room of the suite, Rose was the first one to notice the journal with today's date, which proclaimed opera star missing, fears of abduction. Something sank into the pit of Rose's stomach. The news stated that Cavallaro had mysteriously vanished at Stazione Centrale and that she had not attended any rehearsal. The paper mentioned a name, Arturo Toscanini, music director of La Scala, who confirmed that he had had no contact from the singer since she departed Paris. Rose called for everyone, and a moment later a plan was etched. The occultist and the maid would head to La Scala to understand what might have happened to the poor Miss Cavallaro. Favoring the trace of the Sedefkar Simulacrum, Leopold would visit the Biblioteca Nazionale Braidense, together with the good Dr. Elijah. To Leopold, the clues given by Professor Smith were too thin. A piece was in circulation in Paris just after the Great War and sold to someone from Milan. They had quite a lot of work ahead of themselves if they wanted to find the piece hidden in Lombardy's chief town. Leaving a note for Giovanni in case he came back to the hotel early, they left toward the north of the city center before parting ways. A few streets away, Giovanni walked among the people, drinking it all in. To his dismay, he started noticing the mask of sadness and grief that most Milanese wore. Stopping to speak to a pauper, he asked if the poor soul knew anything of the distress experienced by the population. The wretch, a war veteran, mentioned that it wasn't always like that. Milan used to be a town that breathed fun and joy before the Great War. Somehow things had changed. Giving a few alms, the priest moved on, making his way through the narrow streets of Milan. He didn't care so much for heading straight to the Duomo. He needed to feel the city, to feel his country. He knew the nation was aching, currently in the throes of political turmoil. He wasn't surprised to see Milan in such a state. He arrived at the Piazza del Duomo, the cathedral tearing the sky with its 100 spires, its white and salmon marble absorbing the warm light of the afternoon sun. Unbeknownst to him, Giovanni took greater strides to reach the Duomo, as if called by a mysterious force. People were pouring into the piazza like a busy ant farm, the sound of all the footsteps, the bristling legs of insects. The priest climbed the small steps before the Duomo and disappeared within one of its great wooden doors. Darkness swallowed him whole. The marble bore traces of black, almost like soot. The coated wooden panels and pews were of a deep and dark brown. To Giovanni, the church felt more menacing than welcoming. Yet as soon as another priest present in the cathedral extended a warm hand, all menace was gone from the place. They conversed at length about the state of Milan's flock. To the dismay of Giovanni's counterpart, attendance to service had been lukewarm these past 5 to 6 years. The man blamed it on La Scala, spitting between his teeth, the devil's house. The Milanese priest pointed to 3 old crones sitting by an altar of the Madonna. They work for La Scala, costumes. These poor souls are probably the only ones fighting for God's light within the theatre. Giovanni asked to talk to them. The 3 elderly women fervently kissed his hands. They spoke in Lombard, a thick patois closer to French than Italian. They were praying for poor Caterina Cavallaro, who had disappeared into thin air. One of them said that she might have fled with an old flame. Shocked at the news, Giovanni wanted to head out, wait for his friends at their hotel before investigating the vanishing of Cavallaro. Taking leave of his counterpart and the 3 ladies, the priest headed for the exit. The white light of January blinded the priest. He heard a suspicious noise, but when his eyes came into focus, whatever he had heard was gone. The hotel being a stone's throw away, he headed for it. The receptionist informed him that he had just missed his fellow travelers. Resigned, the priest decided to wander the streets to listen more to the population. Despite Leopold's earlier eye roll, Dr. Marsh quite liked the Belgian fellow. A bit too brooding for his taste, but Elijah could let that slide. After all, if his own father had gone missing, he too would be in a foul mood. His mind went to his poor wife. He might not have lost a father, but his darling was in such a sorry state. The doctor sighed. Every step further away from her felt like his love for her was wavering. He shook his head. No, it wasn't. This feeling was only creeping in on him. He would get her a nice present after their visit to the library. The two gentlemen crossed through a few empty streets before arriving at Via Brera, where the biblioteca awaited them. Asking for directions to a few students, they split up in hopes of finding more information. They sat for hours on end to find even just a crumb about the Sedefkar Simulacrum, but in vain, though the two men did come across an old legend attributed to Verdi, the belief that whoever sings along with an aria at La Scala can cause one's fondest wish to be granted. Tired and slightly frustrated, Elijah excused himself to Leopold, heading out to hunt for a nice piece of jewelry for his wife. Claudia did love a good crowd of journalists. The front steps of La Scala were teeming with journalists holding notepads and tripods. Rose opened the way for her mistress, fending off the press until both of them arrived at the door, where a man shaped like a wardrobe stood guard. Claudia gave a glance to the muckrakers behind, mentioning audibly enough that she was the leader of the Eddie Starkweather Moore expedition. The guard shrugged. What would a guy paid a misery to hold a door ever know about expeditions? The occultist changed tactics, asking for his name. He introduced himself as Marco. Claudia winced at the name, picturing the small file her twin brother had been put in. Though emotional intelligence was not necessarily her forte, she somehow managed to bond with the guard over his name. Whispering in her ear, he revealed a side entrance, far from prying eyes and unguarded. Bidding him farewell, they plunged back into the fedoras and flashes before taking a turn for the side of La Scala, finding the unprotected door mentioned by Marco. Claudia and Rose's senses were assaulted. Around them, dancers and actors and technicians and musicians were getting ready for rehearsals. The crowd was suffocating. The corridors of La Scala were crammed. People were using their shoulders to make their way backstage. One yelled at another while smoking a cigarette, and musicians struggled to find room to pore over their music sheets before heading into the pit. Impossible in this mob to ask where one might find the music director, Arturo Toscanini. The occultist and the maid agreed to part ways in the hopes of bettering their odds at finding Mr. Toscanini. Rose stumbled upon the lodges where she met with Maria, the understudy for the opening Aida. She found a dull girl with a big ego and little talent to boot. Prone to gossip, she did mention that Caterina Cavallaro might have absconded in an Alfa Romeo, the latest model RL. On the other side of the building, after climbing a few flights of disorganized stairs, Claudia finally found the office of Mr. Toscanini. The old and balding music director was biting his nails behind his desk, a cigarette still burning in an ashtray. The occultist pried gently at him, asking where Miss Cavallaro might have gone. Had she mentioned anything to her staff who traveled with the cantatrice? But the music director knew very little. Smacking his tongue and looking lost, he begged Claudia to help him in investigating the disappearance of his prized singer. She nodded courteously before leaving the man to his nails and his cigarette. Eventually, Claudia happened upon Rose, who was chatting with the pianist Rosario Sorbello, a young man in his early 20s. He was practicing not for tomorrow, but for tonight, as he had been invited by the patrons of La Scala to a private show of Aida. When asked by Claudia if he knew whether or not one of the patrons might have something against Cavallaro, the pianist shrugged. "I don't think so. Caterina is loved by everyone here in Milan, including the big wigs." Giovanni let Providence guide him through the arteries of Milan, content to wait out his friends by speaking to the city folk. He arrived in front of a police station where a little troop of factory workers full of soot and tar manifested quietly. A sign at their feet read, "Justice for Ennio Spinola." A police officer talked softly to the workers. "Gents, you should get moving. If the black shirts or my superior see you, you'll be in a world of trouble." Intrigued, the priest headed to the group, hailing them with a blessing, and inquired if he could be of any help. A young worker, barely past 14, stepped from the band. One of their friends and comrades from from the Alfa Romeo factory, Ennio, was found stabbed to death in a laneway off Via Tavazzano in Portello, northwest of town, not 3 days past. The police, bootlickers of Mussolini according to the kid, barely lifted a finger. Sensing such animosity, Giovanni understood the risk of the workers ending up in jail, or worse if they did not move along. Giovanni deftly started preaching to the crowd, asking them to disperse and to trust in the Almighty, to deliver justice for their comrade. Reluctantly, the workers dispersed. Saluting the stupefied policeman, the priest turned around toward the hotel. Leopold found Elijah seated at the biffy, a coffee cup in hand, chatting with an ostensibly rich and idle woman who seemed to disappear under a sprawling purple hat. The good doctor had found a gift for his wife all right, but the mystery woman seemed to clutch the little bag held tightly by Elijah. The Belgian pulled a chair next to his companion and ordered a whiskey. Research makes for a thirsty private eye. The clawed stranger paid him no mind. The doctor winked at the detective.
I will not let go of this present, unless you tell me more about what you know about Madame Cavallaro.
The woman leaned in, covering her mouth with her gloved hands. Cavallaro was seen with one of the patrons of La Scala. Of that, she was sure. She had witnessed it as she waited for her best friend on one of the platforms of Milano Centrale. She recognized the man who picked up the cantatrice, Mr. Flavio Conti. He was driving a beautiful Alfa Romeo RL. Elijah thanked her for the information and yanked his wife's present out of the clutches of the gossiping magpie. He thanked her with a nod and a laugh and turned back to Leopold. His search hadn't been more fruitful after Elijah left. Only this vague myth about La Scala remained. Lifting his gaze from his glass, Leopold saw Giovanni heading toward the hotel and waved at the priest. The man of the cloth shared the clues he had gleaned over the day. La Scala kept coming back. The Milanese priest he had met was adamant it was an all-too-evil place. In passing, he also noted the anecdote of the murdered worker, which got a quizzical look from Dr. Marsh. The worker was employed by an Alfa Romeo factory. Could this be a coincidence, that the man who picked up Caterina drove an Alfa Romeo himself? The clues started inexorably to piece themselves together. Rule number 1 of the private detective: always be mindful of your surroundings. Though nursing his whiskey glass, Leopold kept an eye on the crowd of the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele. Bitten once, twice shy, as they said, the events from Switzerland had made him more paranoid than usual. His gaze landed on a man leaning on a marble column, top hat shoved onto his head, masking his eyes. Only a moustache jutted out from his visage. A slimy and greenish creature, looking like a salamander or a chameleon, crept on his shoulder. The odd man was staring at Leo, who feigned not to notice a thing. Speaking as if it were nothing, and without displaying any worry on his face, he calmly explained to his companions that they were being spied on. The 3 men agreed to leave the table inconspicuously and headed in the general direction of the man. Yet as soon as they were closing in on him, he dashed out under the arch of the Galleria and into the Piazza del Duomo. Something fell, and a crystalline shattering sound echoed all around, a jar of dead moths. The 3 travelers paid the jar no mind and raced behind their stalker. The man had discarded his hat, slithering into the crowd and jumping behind the stalls of peddlers and artists. Rose and Claudia were on their way back when they were shoved aside by a man racing like his life depended on it. A second later, they saw their huffing and puffing friends struggling to make a beeline to get to the man. They yelled at Rose and Claudia to stop him. Too late. The 2 women winced and turned on their heels after the odd man. Their prey slid into a dark alley, deftly climbing over a fence. The occultist didn't want him to escape. She concentrated, ready to take control of his mind, when suddenly she was struck back. It felt like a whip had torn through her flesh, her body wavered, and she felt her skin shriveling. Just like poor Rose. The rest of the group caught up with the maid and her mistress. Leopold yelled for water in the street, while Rose and Elijah climbed the fence. Giovanni, too tired from the chase, couldn't muster enough strength to scale the obstacle ahead. The stalker was gaining ground, further and further away from them. Rose bit her lip. She didn't want her companions to know, but clearly this mysterious man was important to them, and he had hurt Miss Eddy. The maid opened her bag and took out a small gun. The doctor stopped running, shocked. He scrutinized Rose for what seemed like an eternity. She pulled the trigger. A loud explosion echoed through the street. The man came down, his calf bursting in a cloud of blood. Elijah shook himself out of his torpor, heading for their suspect. As soon as he was over him, the man turned around, his chest bare, a piece of flesh cut out and in his hand. He flung it at the doctor. Elijah started suffocating, feeling the piece of skin merge with his own. He fell to the ground. Only a thin strand of air made its way to his nostrils. Sirens blared all around them from both sides of the street. Those still standing tried to justify what had just happened as blackshirts extracted the odd man from the street without even a question. The police confiscated Rose's gun. They cuffed Giovanni, Rose, and Leopold and sent Elijah and Claudia to a nearby hospital. It was pitch black when the priest, the maid, and the private eye were released from jail. They headed for the hotel, sullen. Giovanni had somehow managed to release them all. He tried to shun his conversation with the chief commissioner to the far corners of his mind. They had one more day in Milan before being expelled from the town with the first Orient Express. Somehow, they had managed to chase a person with tremendous influence over Milan. They would have to be very careful not to anger the blackshirts. It was a miracle the police had let them go. Back at the hotel, Rose quickly dashed to her room and closed the door behind her. She looked under her bed, where a little shoebox was hidden, a new gun and a good luck note. The maid burned the note and pocketed her new weapon. When she came back to the main room, Claudia and Elijah stepped into the suite. Her mistress was in a sorry state, but the doctors had helped plenty. Marsh had a few stitches, but the piece of skin had been removed from his face. They all sat down in silence, each ruminating on the events of the day. Leopold eyed Rose and wondered, who really was this woman? Suddenly they heard her, Caterina Cavallaro, her diamond voice echoing through the gallery. They dared to step onto the balcony and saw a hooded figure below. Giovanni, Rose, and Elijah descended the stairs as fast as they could, but the figure had vanished. Still the singing reverberated through the Galleria. Following the sound, they saw the silhouette vanish among a crowd of blackshirts and other hooded figures. Wanting to avoid any sort of trouble, the three travelers made their way back to their room. Waking up was an ordeal for most of our investigators, beaten and tired. It took them all their strength to step out of their beds. Small mercy, the room service was impeccable, and the food gave them heart. The socialite paper, left by the staff alongside the breakfast, made mention of the soirée which hosted the patrons of La Scala. It had been a resounding success. Mr. Conti was portrayed as the life of the party after a miraculous recovery from tuberculosis not 3 days past. The group would split once more, Giovanni and Elijah heading on the trail of Ennio Spinola's murder, while Claudia, Rose, and Leopold would search for Conti's address in order to pay the man a visit. All shook hands on a rendezvous at La Scala for the opening of Ida in the evening. The priest and the doctor made their way northwest to Via Tavazzano, where the body of Ennio Spinola had been found. Shivers were sent down their spines when they reached their destination. No one had cared to remove the blood. Crimson traces rested between the cobblestones of the busy district. The body seemed to have been dropped here, as if from a car. Looking closer, Elijah found droplets of blood in a nearby alley. Clearly, the police had not given this case much interest. The two men proceeded into a tall and narrow street standing between rows of warehouses. The blood led them to an iron door of a nondescript storage unit. Forcing their way into the room, they stopped as soon as the door stood ajar. A horrendous scene lay before them. 2 sacrificial altars made of wooden boxes rested in the center of a small room. Blood caked all around one of them.
I believe we have found our murder scene,
commented the doctor coldly. Inside, the trail went cold. Nothing seemed of interest until Giovanni removed a tarp covering more wooden boxes. These bore a name, Fattori Conti. Closing the warehouse and retracing their steps, they met a newspaper boy who handed them a local Milanese paper. The front page discussed the disappearance of Cavallaro and her ghost voice from the previous evening. To Arturo Toscanini, the music director, this was pure malarkey, and he announced that Aida would still have its grand opening. Further down in the same article, the props manager of the opera, Paolo Riscianti, stated that La Scala had endured a string of bad luck with no end in sight, including the curse of the costumier, which piqued Giovanni's interest. Finding the address of Flavio Conti had been child's play for Leopold. Their party of three was now entering the barren little garden of Conti's villa. Just out in front of the garage, an Alfa Romeo RL. They were greeted by a butler who ushered them inside the house. No trouble here again with Claudia's cover of wanting to purchase an old Alfa Romeo model. It was quite cold, all the windows were wide open. Anticipating a question on the subject, the butler explained that since his recovery, Mr. Conti wanted to feel the fresh air as much and as often as possible. The butler asked them to follow him to the second floor, Mr. Conti being in his office. The footman announced the investigators, opened the door, and promptly closed it behind them. They entered a spacious room with lacquered wood on the floor and ceiling. At the end of it sat the frail Mr. Conti. They talked a while about cars, but it soon became apparent that none of the three companions knew anything about them. Conti's behavior started to change as the line of questioning became clearer. Where was Caterina? The man rose from his desk, grabbing a gun from a drawer and aiming it at Claudia. Craven, the man started talking, while facial tics overtook his face. Caterina was with Arturo Faccia, the man who saved his life. Faccia was part of the Brothers of the Skin cult and made Conti immortal in exchange for bringing him the opera singer. The cultist stole Cavallaro's voice to fulfill the legend of La Scala in order to find a piece of artifact. The questions kept piling on, and the businessman started yelling, now determined to fire at Claudia. A shot was fired. Claudia dodged to the ground. The butler, alerted by the screams of his master, lay dead on the ground in the doorframe. Conti aimed his weapon again, but it was too late. Claudia took control of his mind, the spell bearing a hefty toll on the occultist's psyche. Outside, military yells and heavy bootsteps were heard, black shirts. Surely they had followed the three companions. Feeling increasingly cornered by the sound of the boots on the floor below, Claudia bit her lip. Through sheer willpower, she ordered Conti to go downstairs and take out all enemies, be they police or black shirts, before turning the weapon against himself. The shell of Conti walked quietly to the door. It felt like time had suspended itself. Then a roaring bang, and another, followed by more. The three companions jumped out the window, bruising their knees and ankles before escaping through the back of the garden. The investigators barely had time to change into more elegant outfits, but they made it in time for the opening of Aida. The public spoke in hushed voices, a heavy weight behind their tone, Cavallaro present in everyone's mind. Rose and Claudia entered the theatre through the main entrance, in a sea of suits and silks. The rest of the group took the side entrance the guard had shown to the maid and the occultist. Giovanni led the charge, cognizant that time was of the essence. Together with the doctor and the detective, they asked around for Paolo Riscianti, the props manager. After badgering many extras and dancers, they got their answer. The man was pale, tall and twig-like. He smoked his lungs away, anxious. When the three companions asked about what he had mentioned regarding the costumier's curse, he gave a chilling account that nearly all costumiers over the past 6 to 7 years barely lasted 6 months, dead or gravely ill. The man gave directions to the costumier's room under the roof before cheekily asking about Caterina, but the three investigators had vanished already. Cavallaro didn't lie. She did get the 5 travelers the best seats in the house, thought Claudia as she sat with Rose. Despite the lack of talent of the understudy, the Aida was a pleasant production, but not good enough as to utterly draw in Rose and Claudia. The 2 women were hunting discreetly for Faccia, hoping to catch him before he got his wish. The trail was slim. The only hint given by Conti was that the man had stolen the cantatrice's voice. Claudia felt beads of cold, anxious sweat rolling down her spine. The first act was already approaching its end. The attic of La Scala was unbearably hot for January. Giovanni, Leopold, and Elijah were out of breath, listening to the three old crones the priest had met the day before. They had a new lead costumier, Lucia. That one was solid. She had started only a few weeks ago, but nothing bad had befallen her. The three companions pressed the old ladies with more questions. One of them mentioned that the curse seemed to have coincided with the purchase of a torso for a mannequin, opalescent and blue. They had brought it downstairs as a prop at the very beginning of preparations for the production of Ida. It should be below the stage, as they planned to use it to display some armor when Ritorno Vincitor began. The three men shared a knowing look. Thanking their elders hurriedly, they slid down the stairs until they were under the stage. Giovanni lied through his teeth to the guards, stating the three men were extras and had been asked to move a prop by Riscianti. It took them a few good minutes before finally locating the prop, standing on a platform wired to rise on stage. Above them, the haunting aria of Ritorno Vincitor took flight. The three companions tried to move the prop with little success. With a surge of zealousness, Giovanni pushed harder, as if ordered by God, and the prop slid over. A second later, the platform rose. A slight confusion in the notes from the singers, a butterfly-like murmur in the auditorium. The singing resumed instantly. Leopold and Elijah removed the armor from the dummy. In front of them, the shimmering torso of the simulacrum. They unscrewed the torso in all haste, grabbing a sheet before bringing it backstage. In the auditorium, Rose heard the voice of Cavallaro as Ritorno Vincitor was approaching its final notes. Turning around, she saw the man they had pursued in the streets yesterday. Next to him stood a frail old woman looking catatonic, but she was not unknown to Rose. It sank in. This person was Cavallaro. What horror had Faccia done to the poor woman? The maid felt ill and revolted. Rose let Percy out of her bag to disturb the man. He shoved the cat with a kick, poor Percy racing to hide back in Rose's bag. Seeing Percy's failed attempt at a distraction, Claudia whispered to Rose that she was about to fake a feint to cause a ruckus. Truth be told, the heat was unbearable. Everything would have to be interrupted. They would have to stop the production. On three, Claudia let herself fall to the ground with a light thump. Rose screamed as best as she could. Lights were turned on, a doctor was called. Claudia was carried out, the production halted, and people were asked to wait outside or in the atrium. The maid and the occultist were ushered outside as Claudia played the heat stroke marvelously. As soon as their rescuers and doctors let their guard down, they absconded in the darkness and back into La Scala through the infamous side entrance, where they met nearly face to face with Giovanni, Leopold, and Elijah, holding what looked like a huge chunk of meat under wraps. The commotion caused by Claudia and Rose was the perfect cover, not a black shirt in sight. Under the cover of the clouds, they made it back to their hotel, where they prepared their luggage for the first Orient Express come morning. The restaurant carriage oscillated with the rhythm of the tracks. The investigators were huddled up at a table, sipping coffee and eating a few scones. On the table, the newspaper of the day revealed that Faccia had died, impaled on one of the spires of the Duomo, an unnatural feat requiring more than human strength according to the chief commissioner. The events of Milan left a bittersweet taste in the mouths of our companions, as they felt that they didn't get closure for the poor Caterina Cavallaro, but they couldn't have stayed and helped even if they had wanted to. Rose took Professor Smith's notes. The next piece of the Sedefkar Simulacrum would await them in Venice, their following stop. Giovanni stopped Rose. Someone was sobbing. All glanced around. Behind their table, a woman veiled in black stared out the window, muttering under her breath.